June 28, 1575, on the plain of Shitaragahara in what is now Aichi Prefecture, Japan. The morning mist clung to the Rengagawa stream as 15,000 warriors of the Takeda clan prepared to face an enemy that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. These were not ordinary soldiers. The Takeda forces represented the most feared military power in Japan, commanded by Takeda Katsuyori, son of the legendary Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai. Their cavalry had crushed armies across the Japanese archipelago. Seasoned samurai who had fought for decades stood in their ranks. They had never known defeat. Across the stream, behind hastily constructed wooden palisades, 38,000 men of the allied forces of Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu waited. Among them stood something new, something the Takeda commanders had seen before but never in these numbers. 3,000 matchlock gunners, peasant foot soldiers called ashigaru, clutching their tanegashima firearms with powder kept dry despite the overnight rain. What happened over the next 8 hours would change Japanese warfare forever. The sound of massed gunfire would replace the whistle of arrows, the charge of mounted samurai would break against walls of lead, and the most powerful cavalry force in Asia would be shattered by weapons that had arrived in Japan just 32 years earlier. This is the story of how Portuguese matchlocks stunned the strongest cavalry in Asia. To understand the shock of Nagashino, you must first understand what the Takeda cavalry represented. The Takeda clan traced their lineage back to Empress Seiwa in the 9th century, making them descendants of heaven itself. But it was Takeda Shingen who transformed them from regional lords into a military juggernaut that made even the greatest warlords nervous. Shingen had seized power from his own father in 1541, a bloodless coup that revealed his tactical brilliance from the start. He understood that Japan's mountainous terrain required a different kind of warfare. While other daimyo relied on traditional samurai fighting styles, Shingen revolutionized mounted combat. He removed the bows from his horsemen and armed them with lances, creating what became known as the Takeda Kiba Gundan, the mounted army. His innovation wasn't about breeding larger horses or importing European cavalry tactics. Japanese horses were small compared to European war horses, typically standing about 13 hands high. What Shingen created was something uniquely Japanese, cavalry that could navigate mountain passes and forest trails, while still delivering devastating charges on open ground. He recruited horsemen from the Kanto Plains, particularly western Kozuke, where generations of families had raised horses and developed exceptional riding skills. These men weren't just mounted archers who occasionally fought on horseback. They were lancers trained to charge in coordinated groups, crashing into enemy formations with disciplined fury. The psychological impact was enormous. When armies heard that the Takeda were approaching, they knew what was coming. The thunder of hooves, the sight of red armoured horsemen bearing down with lowered lances, the inevitable moment when their lines would break and the slaughter would begin. Shingen's philosophy was encapsulated in 4 characters painted on his war banners: Furin Kazan, swift as wind, silent as forest, fierce as fire, immovable as mountain. This code from Sun Tzu's Art of War wasn't just poetry, it was tactical doctrine. His cavalry moved with devastating speed, struck with overwhelming force, and held ground with unshakable resolve. The reputation was earned in blood. At the Battle of Mikatagahara in 1573, Shingen's cavalry had faced Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. The Tokugawa forces had been equipped with some of the new matchlock guns, firearms that supposedly would change warfare. Ieyasu believed his gunners could stop the Takeda charge. He was catastrophically wrong. The Takeda cavalry overran the Tokugawa positions, trampled the gunners before they could reload, and slaughtered nearly the entire army. Ieyasu himself barely escaped with his life, reportedly so terrified that he soiled himself during the flight. That defeat haunted Ieyasu. It also taught him that guns alone weren't enough. You needed tactics, defensive positions, and the discipline to use firearms in ways that nullified cavalry advantages. By 1575, both Ieyasu and his ally Oda Nobunaga understood this. But Takeda Katsuyori, who had inherited his father's army when Shingen died in 1573, did not. The weapons that would decide the battle had arrived in Japan in 1543, when a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese adventurers was blown off course and anchored at Tanegashima Island in southern Japan. The 16-year-old lord of the island, Tanegashima Tokitaka, watched in amazement as the Portuguese demonstrated their matchlock arquebuses. The weapons were crude by later standards, smoothbore barrels about 1 meter long with an effective range of only 80 to 100 meters. Loading was slow and cumbersome. An experienced archer could fire 15 arrows in the time it took a gunner to load, aim and fire once. In rain, the weapons were nearly useless as damp powder wouldn't ignite. But Tokitaka immediately grasped their revolutionary potential. A farmer could be trained to use a matchlock in weeks. A bow required years of practice to master. Samurai had spent lifetimes perfecting their martial skills. Now a peasant conscript with minimal training could kill an armoured warrior from 100 metres away. Tokitaka purchased 2 matchlock muskets from the Portuguese for an enormous sum. He handed one to his best swordsmith Yaita Kinbi Kiyosada, with orders to copy it. The smith had little trouble replicating most of the weapon. The barrel, the stock, the serpentine mechanism that brought the burning matchcord down to ignite the powder. But one component stumped him, completely. The breech screw, the threaded bolt that sealed the rear of the barrel. Japan had never developed screw threading technology. The gun couldn't function without it. When the Portuguese ship sailed away, the project seemed doomed, but Tokitaka was determined. The next year, when Portuguese traders returned, he convinced a Portuguese blacksmith to remain in Japan and teach the Japanese smiths the secret of threading metal. Within months, the technology spread. Within a decade, Japan was producing over 300,000 matchlock firearms. Within a generation, Japan possessed more guns than any European nation. The transformation was staggering. Japanese swordsmiths were among the finest metalworkers in the world, capable of forging blades of legendary quality. They adapted their skills to gun-making with enthusiasm. Production centres emerged at Sakai, Kunitomo, and Tanegashima itself. The weapons Japanese smiths produced were more accurate than European equivalents. They developed innovations the Portuguese hadn't conceived. Lacquered boxes to protect the firing mechanism from rain, measured strings attached to sights for accurate night firing, larger caliber weapons for increased stopping power, serial firing techniques where ranks of gunners would take turns shooting to create continuous fire. But effectiveness and acceptance were different things. The samurai class viewed firearms with deep ambivalence. These were warriors whose entire identity centered on personal combat skill, on mastery of the sword and bow, on face-to-face courage in battle. Guns required none of these qualities. A coward could kill a hero from 100 meters with a weapon any peasant could operate. It violated every principle of Bushido. Yet pragmatic warlords recognized reality. In 1549, just 6 years after guns arrived in Japan, Oda Nobunaga ordered 500 matchlocks manufactured for his armies. In 1567, even Takeda Shingen, the master of cavalry warfare, announced that henceforth guns will be the most important arms. Therefore decrease the number of spears per unit and have your most capable men carry guns. Both sides at Nagashino understood the value of firearms. The Takeda forces included substantial numbers of gunners. What made Nagashino different wasn't simply the presence of guns. It was how Oda Nobunaga deployed them in combination with terrain and defensive structures to create a killing zone that negated every Takeda advantage. The road to Nagashino began with a siege. In June 1575, Takeda Katsuyori led 15,000 men into Tokugawa territory and surrounded Nagashino Castle, a strategic fortress held by just 500 defenders under the command of Okudaira Sadamasa. Katsuyori needed the castle. It controlled vital supply routes for any invasion of Tokugawa lands. The siege was brutal. The defenders, equipped with 200 matchlocks and small cannon, held out stubbornly. But after their provisions' storehouse was destroyed, collapse seemed imminent. In a desperate gamble, a samurai named Tori Suniman volunteered to slip through enemy lines and reach Tokugawa Ieyasu's headquarters 20 miles away to plead for reinforcement. Tori succeeded in reaching Ieyasu, who immediately contacted his ally Oda Nobunaga. Together they assembled a massive relief force. 30,000 men from Nobunaga's domains, 8,000 from Tokugawa's lands, and crucially, 3,000 matchlock gunners under samurai command. When Tori attempted to return to the castle to inform the defenders that help was coming, he was captured by Takeda forces. The Takeda commanders had him crucified in sight of the castle walls and ordered him to call out that no help was coming, that the defenders should surrender. Instead, Tori used his final moments to shout the truth. "Iyasu's men are on the way. Hold fast." He was immediately executed. His courage became legendary. A captured Takeda detachment was so moved by his sacrifice that they designed a battle flag featuring his crucifixion. Tori was posthumously promoted to full hereditary samurai status. His defiance had bought the time needed for the relief force to arrive. Nobunaga understood cavalry. He had faced Takeda charges before and barely survived. He knew that in open battle, on level ground, the Takeda horsemen would smash through his lines, regardless of how many guns he possessed. So he chose his battlefield with ruthless calculation. The plain of Shitaragahara offered several natural advantages. The Rengogawa stream crossed the field, its steep banks perfect for disrupting cavalry charges. Beyond the stream, Nobunaga ordered construction of defensive fortifications unlike anything previously seen in Japanese warfare. His soldiers worked through the night, constructing a palisade nearly 2 kilometers long. The fence wasn't solid. Gaps were deliberately left at intervals. This wasn't weakness, but tactical brilliance. The gaps would channel attacking cavalry into killing zones where concentrated fire could destroy them. Behind the palisade, Nobunaga positioned his 3,000 gunners in organized ranks under the command of samurai officers. This was revolutionary. High-ranking samurai typically refused to directly command a Shigeru foot soldiers. The class distinction was too great. But Nobunaga understood that disciplined fire required disciplined command. His samurai officers had authority to control when the guns fired, ensuring volleys rather than ragged individual shots. Behind the gunners, spearmen waited. If cavalry penetrated the palisade, long spears would thrust through the fence gaps, impaling horses and riders. And behind them, samurai warriors stood ready for close combat if enemy forces broke through entirely. The defensive position was tested by nature itself. Rain fell heavily the night before battle. Takeda commanders, observing from across the plain, believed this sealed their victory. Surely the overnight rain had dampened the powder of Nobunaga's guns. The weapons would be useless. This was the moment to attack. They were wrong. Nobunaga's gunners had kept their powder dry using covered containers, and they had been trained to maintain their weapons even in adverse conditions. When dawn broke on June 28th, the Takeda forces were trapped in an impossible situation. Behind them, a Tokugawa detachment under Sakai Tadatsugu had attacked and captured Tobigasu Fortress, threatening the Takeda rear. Ahead, the massive allied army waited behind its palisades. Strategic withdrawal made sense. Many of Takeda Katsuyori's veteran commanders advised retreat. But Katsuyori was young, ambitious, and desperate to match his legendary father's reputation. He ordered the attack. The Takeda cavalry began their charge across the plain. Red-armoured horsemen thundering forward with lowered lances, the same sight that had broken armies from one end of Japan to the other. They had done this 100 times. They knew how it ended. The enemy would see them coming and panic. Formations would waver. Men would break and run. Then the slaughter would begin. But this time was different. The Allied forces didn't break, didn't waver. Behind their palisades, samurai officers held their gunners in check. The Takeda cavalry crashed down the far bank of the Rengogawa stream, struggled up the near side and charged toward the wooden fence. Still the Allied forces held fire. The horsemen closed to 150 meters, 100 meters, 75 meters. Then the order came. Fire. 1,000 matchlocks discharged simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything the Takeda warriors had experienced. Not the sharp crack of a few scattered guns, but a continuous roar of massed gunfire. Smoke erupted along the palisade line, and in the killing zone before the fence, men and horses fell in heaps. The leading rank of cavalry simply ceased to exist. Riders pitched backward as lead balls smashed through armor. Horses screamed and went down, crushing their riders, creating barriers that tripped following horses. The charge staggered, but the Takeda were elite warriors. They'd faced arrows before. Surely after that first volley they could close the distance before the guns could reload. But as the smoke cleared and the survivors spurred their horses forward, the second rank of gunners fired. Then the third rank. The continuous volleys were devastating. Every time the Takeda cavalry began to recover momentum, another 1,000 matchlocks fired. Those who reached the palisade found themselves in an even worse nightmare. The fence gaps that had seemed like vulnerabilities were designed killing zones. Cavalry funneled into the openings where spearmen thrust long weapons through the palisade gaps, impaling horses and riders. Those who broke through the fence line found themselves surrounded and cut down by waiting samurai. All across the 2-kilometer front the pattern repeated. Charge, volley fire, slaughter, retreat, regroup, charge again. The Takeda, displaying courage that bordered on insanity, attacked again and again. Among them rode Yamagata Masakage, one of the 24 generals of Takeda Shingen, famous throughout Japan as one of the greatest warriors of the age. Yamagata led a desperate assault against the Allied positions, his red armour visible even through the gun smoke. Naruse Masakazu, a Tokugawa officer, identified Yamagata's banner and directed concentrated fire at him. Multiple matchlock balls struck home. Yamagata fell dead before the palisade. The battle lasted 8 hours. From early morning until mid-afternoon the Takeda forces attacked, and for 8 hours the guns never stopped. The steady drumbeat of volleys, the mechanical rhythm of loading and firing, no honour, no individual combat, just industrial slaughter. By afternoon the Takeda forces were finished. Not defeated in the traditional sense, annihilated. They broke and fled. And as they retreated in disorder, Nobunaga's forces poured through the palisade gaps and pursued, cutting down exhausted men who no longer had the strength to fight. The casualties were catastrophic. Traditional sources claim 10,000 Takeda dead, 2/3 of the besieging force. Modern historians consider this exaggerated but agree losses were staggering. 8 of the 24 generals died at Nagashino. The flower of Takeda military leadership, men who had served Shingen himself, perished in a single day. Baba Nobuharu, who had fought in more battles than most men lived years. Naito Masatoyo, whose tactical brilliance had won countless victories. Yamagata Masakage, whose red-armoured cavalry had been the tip of Takeda's spear. All dead, shot down by peasants with matchlocks. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the casualties. For generations, the samurai warrior class had believed in the supremacy of personal martial skill, the idea that individual courage, training, and the quality of one's weapons and armour determined victory. Nagashino shattered this worldview. It demonstrated that disciplined common soldiers with firearms, properly positioned and commanded, could annihilate the finest warriors in Japan. The matchlock, that crude weapon introduced by Portuguese sailors barely 3 decades earlier, had proven more decisive than centuries of samurai tradition. Oda Nobunaga understood what he'd proven. He'd shown that modern warfare was about organization, logistics, and the effective deployment of technology. Not individual heroism, not the charge of mounted samurai, not the ancient traditions that every warrior had been raised to revere. The future belonged to whoever could produce the most guns, train the most soldiers, and deploy them with cold tactical efficiency. Other daimyo learned the lesson. Firearms proliferated across Japan. By the 1580s, Detta Masamune's forces were 70% armed with guns. At the Battle of Numajiri in 1584, Satake, Yoshishige fielded over 8,600 matchlocks. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded Korea in 1592, a quarter of his 160,000-man invasion force were gunners. They captured Seoul in just 18 days, their firearms overwhelming Korean and Chinese forces who had far less experience with the weapons. But the Takeda never recovered. Takeda Katsuyori survived Nagashino, but his clan was broken. The loss of so many veteran commanders and elite warriors couldn't be replaced. Within 7 years, Oda and Tokugawa forces invaded Kai province itself. Katsuyori, trapped with the remnants of his army, committed seppuku. The Takeda clan, descendants of emperors, masters of cavalry warfare, the terror of Japan for 2 generations, was finished. And with them died the age of the mounted samurai as the dominant force in Japanese warfare. The irony is profound. The Takeda themselves had recognized the importance of firearms. Takeda Shingen had ordered his men to adopt guns as their primary weapons. Katsuyori had matchlock units in his army at Nagashino, but they'd never fully committed to the implications of gunpowder warfare. They'd treated firearms as just another weapon to add to their arsenal, not as a technology that fundamentally changed the nature of battle. Oda Nobunaga understood the deeper truth. Guns weren't just weapons. They were a revolution. They meant that warfare was no longer about elite warriors, but about whoever could mobilize more resources, train more soldiers, and maintain larger armies. The skills that took a lifetime to develop, the martial traditions that defined the samurai class, became less relevant than the ability to recruit peasants and teach them to point a matchlock and pull a trigger. The matchlock itself was a relatively simple weapon, but its impact was revolutionary. The tanegashima worked through a basic mechanism. A serpentine clamp held a length of slow-burning match cord. When the trigger was pulled, the serpentine pivoted downward, bringing the glowing match into contact with powder in the pan. The flash passed through a touch hole to ignite the main charge in the barrel, propelling the lead ball out of the muzzle. Loading was a multi-step process. Pour powder down the barrel, ram a lead ball down on top of the powder, prime the pan with fine powder, adjust the match in the serpentine, aim and fire. A trained gunner could fire perhaps 2 shots per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with shaking hands and powder smoke obscuring vision, the rate dropped to perhaps 1 shot per minute. The weapons were inaccurate beyond 100 meters. The smoothbore barrel meant balls tumbled in flight. Wind affected trajectory. Individual marksmanship was nearly impossible, but none of this mattered when you had thousands of guns firing in volley. Individual accuracy was irrelevant. Massed fire created a beaten zone where the sheer density of projectiles made hits inevitable, and unlike arrows, which could be seen in flight and potentially dodged, matchlock balls travelled too fast to track. By the time you heard the shot, you were already hit or missed. The psychological effect was devastating. Arrows were familiar. Warriors had trained against them their entire lives. They knew the sound, understood the danger, had armour designed to deflect them. But matchlocks were different. The smoke, the thunderous report, the invisible projectiles that punched through the finest armour. It created a kind of helplessness that demoralised even veteran troops. Japanese smiths, adapting the Portuguese design, made numerous improvements. They experimented with larger calibers, creating matchlocks that fired balls weighing up to 20 mom, nearly 100 grams, capable of penetrating multiple layers of armour and killing horses with single shots. They developed protective covers for the firing mechanism, allowing weapons to function even in rain. They created specialised sights and measuring devices for accurate fire at night. They manufactured portable shields that gunners could deploy for protection while reloading. The scale of production was remarkable. Within 30 years of the matchlock's introduction, Japan was manufacturing firearms in quantities that exceeded total European production. Cities like Kunitomo became specialized gun manufacturing centers, with entire districts devoted to barrel forging, stock-making, lock assembly. By the end of the 16th century, there were possibly 500,000 matchlock firearms in Japan, making it the most heavily armed nation on Earth. This proliferation fundamentally changed Japanese society. The ashigaru, foot soldier armed with a matchlock, became the backbone of feudal armies. The samurai class, while still providing leadership and serving as elite shock troops, could no longer win battles through martial prowess alone. Victory required money to purchase guns, organizational skill to train gunners, and tactical intelligence to deploy them effectively. The transition wasn't universally embraced. Conservative samurai despised firearms as unhonorable weapons that reduced warfare to mere mechanical slaughter. They longed for the days when battles were decided by individual combat between warriors of equal rank, when personal courage and skill determined who lived and died. But nostalgia couldn't stop lead balls. Those who clung to traditional methods were swept aside by those who mastered the new technology. The social implications were profound. For centuries, warfare had been the exclusive domain of the samurai class. Peasants might serve as porters or labourers, but actual fighting was reserved for professional warriors who'd spent lifetimes training. Now, suddenly, peasant soldiers with a few weeks' training could kill samurai at range. This democratization of military power concerned the ruling class. If peasants with guns could kill samurai, what stopped them from turning those guns on? Their lords? This fear would later contribute to strict regulations on firearms ownership during the peaceful Edo period. But in the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, practical necessity overrode social concerns. Daimyo who wanted to survive needed gunners. Lots of them, and that meant arming commoners and trusting them in battle. The training methods evolved to maximize effectiveness. Gunners practiced serial firing techniques where front ranks would fire and then step back to reload while rear ranks advanced and fired. This created nearly continuous fire, the tactic Nobunaga employed so effectively at Nagashino. commanders learned to position gunners behind natural or artificial cover, protecting them during the vulnerable reloading period. They developed doctrine for combined arms warfare, using spearmen to protect gunners from cavalry charges and samurai to exploit gaps created by gunfire. The defeat at Nagashino became central to the mythology of Oda Nobunaga's rise. Later histories would claim he'd invented the three-stage firing technique at Nagashino, though modern scholarship questions this. What isn't in question is that Nobunaga grasped the tactical potential of massed firearms earlier and more completely than his rivals. He controlled Sakai, Japan's major trading port, giving him access to imported gunpowder ingredients, lead for shot, and the merchants who supplied military equipment. He understood logistics in ways his more traditional opponents didn't. While other daimyo saw guns as expensive novelties, Nobunaga saw them as force multipliers that gave him decisive advantages over armies that outnumbered him. This understanding extended beyond just firearms. Nobunaga was revolutionary in other ways. He promoted based on merit rather than birth. He ruthlessly suppressed Buddhist monasteries that opposed him, showing no respect for religious authority. He built roads and standardized measurements to improve commerce. He was, in many ways, Japan's first modern military leader, someone who understood that power came from economic strength, organizational efficiency, and technological superiority as much as from warrior courage. The matchlock's dominance in Japan lasted for over 2 centuries. During the peaceful Edo period that began after 1603, firearms production continued, but their use declined. With no major wars to fight, tanegashima were primarily used for hunting and ceremonial purposes. The relative isolation of Tokugawa Japan meant that when firearms technology advanced in Europe, with the development of flintlocks, percussion caps, and eventually breech-loading rifles, Japan didn't adopt these innovations. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1854, the Japanese were still using essentially the same matchlock designs that had been introduced in 1543. The last major use of samurai armor and traditional matchlocks was during the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, when samurai rebels fought the modern Imperial Japanese army. Contrary to romantic depictions, these rebels used matchlocks and captured artillery, not just swords and bows. But they were overwhelmingly outmatched by modern firearms and military organization. The rebellion's suppression marked the definitive end of the samurai era. Looking back, Nagashino stands as one of history's pivotal battles, a moment when new technology and tactics decisively defeated a military system that had dominated for centuries. The parallel to European battles like Crécy or Agincourt is striking. In each case, new weapons and tactics, deployed by commanders who understood their potential, shattered seemingly invincible forces. But Nagashino's significance goes deeper. It marked Japan's rapid adoption of foreign technology and its adaptation to Japanese conditions. Within 30 years of first seeing matchlocks, Japan was not only manufacturing them in huge quantities, but improving on the original designs and employing them with tactical sophistication that exceeded European practice. This pattern, rapid adoption and improvement of foreign technology, would repeat in the 19th century when Japan transformed itself from a feudal society to an industrial power in a single generation. The Tanegashima story shows this wasn't a new phenomenon. Japan had demonstrated this capacity for transformation 3 centuries earlier. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of skilled warriors died at Nagashino. The Takeda clan, which had produced some of Japan's greatest military leaders, was destroyed. The samurai class, which had defined Japanese culture for centuries, found its martial supremacy undermined by weapons peasants could operate. The old certainties that honor and skill and courage determined victory proved hollow when faced with massed gunfire from disciplined ranks of ashigaru. For the Takeda cavalry, the shock must have been total. These were men who'd won countless battles, who'd charged into arrow storms and spear walls and emerged victorious, who'd built reputations as unstoppable warriors, and they were slaughtered by peasants with guns they could barely understand, fired from behind wooden fences in tactics that had nothing to do with honor or martial skill. The very foundations of their worldview collapsed in those 8 hours on Shitaragahara Plain. Oda Nobunaga didn't live to see the complete transformation his tactics initiated. He was assassinated in 1582 by a subordinate. But his legacy endured. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who succeeded him, used similar tactics to complete the unification of Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established the shogunate that would rule for 250 years, had learned the lessons of Nagashino. When he fought the climactic Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 that gave him control of Japan, firearms played crucial roles on both sides. The age of the mounted samurai as the decisive military force was finished. The matchlock had killed it, not through any inherent superiority of the weapon itself, which was crude and slow and inaccurate, but through the tactical systems that grew around it. Massed fire, defensive positions, disciplined commands, the transformation of warfare from individual combat between elite warriors to organized violence between disciplined armies. This was the real revolution the Tanegashima brought to Japan. For the Takeda cavalry, finest horsemen in Asia, terror of Japan's battlefields for 2 generations, Nagashino was the end. They'd met an enemy that didn't fight according to the rules they understood. That didn't value individual prowess or heroic charges. That treated warfare as a mechanical problem to be solved through organization and firepower. The thunder of matchlock volleys replaced the thunder of cavalry charges. The systematic slaughter of massed gunfire replaced the glory of samurai combat. And the strongest cavalry in Asia learned, in the most brutal way possible, that the future belonged to whoever controlled the guns. The matchlock, that crude weapon brought by Portuguese sailors blown off course by a storm, had changed Japanese history forever. The Takeda weren't the only ones shocked by what happened at Nagashino. Across Japan, military commanders studied the battle's implications with growing alarm. The Mori clan, masters of naval warfare in western Japan, immediately began expanding their firearms production. The Shimazu of Kyushu, who had been relatively slow to adopt matchlocks, suddenly accelerated their procurement programs. Even the Wasugi, traditional rivals of the Takeda, recognized that their own cavalry tactics were now obsolete. The speed of this transformation reveals something crucial about the Tanegashima's impact. This wasn't simply a story of one battle. It was the culmination of 3 decades of experimentation, adaptation, and gradual tactical evolution that Nagashino crystallized into undeniable reality. The Portuguese who brought those first matchlocks to Tanegashima in 1543 could never have imagined the scale of adoption that would follow. Within a decade, Japanese craftsmen had not only mastered the manufacturing process, but were producing weapons superior to European equivalents. By 1560, matchlocks were common enough that most major daimyo equipped at least some units with them. By 1575, they were fundamental to military planning. This represented an industrial and organizational achievement that matched the tactical revolution. Consider what was required. Every matchlock needed a precisely bored barrel, typically made from wrought iron or steel, hammered around a mandrel and then carefully drilled. The breech plug required precise threading, a technology Japan had to learn from scratch. The lock mechanism needed springs, screws, and moving parts machined to tolerances that allowed reliable function. Each weapon represented dozens of hours of skilled metalwork. Yet Japan produced these weapons by the hundreds of thousands. The gunpowder itself was another challenge. The formula, 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur, required ingredients that weren't all readily available in Japan. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was the key component and the most difficult to obtain. In Europe, saltpeter was extracted from manure piles and cellars, where it crystallized naturally. Japan adopted similar methods, but also imported substantial quantities from China and Southeast Asia. The Sakai merchants who dominated this trade became enormously wealthy and politically influential, their control over gunpowder supplies giving them leverage over the daimyo who depended on firearms. Lead for bullets was easier to obtain. Japan had lead mines and the metal could be recycled from temple roofing and other sources. Each matchlock ball was cast individually in brass molds, a simple process that even common soldiers could perform at camp. The standard ball weighed about 2 to 3 momme, roughly 8 to 12 grams, though sizes varied widely. Larger caliber weapons fired balls up to 100 grams for use against fortifications or horses. The quality control was remarkable. Archaeological excavations of battle sites have recovered thousands of matchlock balls, and analysis shows consistent weight and composition, indicating standardized production methods. This wasn't crude frontier manufacturing. This was sophisticated industrial production applied to military needs. The matchcord itself was another crucial component often overlooked. Made from hemp rope soaked in saltpeter solution and dried, A good match burned slowly and steadily without producing excessive smoke. Poor quality match could fail at critical moments, leaving gunners defenseless. Producing reliable match in the quantities needed for armies of thousands required organized supply chains and quality control. Everything about matchlock warfare required logistical sophistication that went far beyond traditional samurai combat. The training methods developed to maximize gunner effectiveness were equally sophisticated. New recruits spent their first days simply learning to handle the weapon safely, understanding that a dropped match near powder stores could destroy an entire encampment. They learned the loading sequence through endless repetition until they could perform it without thinking, muscle memory that would serve them when powder smoke obscured everything and enemy cavalry charged their positions. Aim training was pragmatic. Individual marksmanship was less important than understanding the concept of massed fire. Gunners learned to aim at the center of massive enemy formations, not at individual targets. They practiced firing in ranks, the front rank kneeling, middle rank standing, rear rank elevated on platforms or terrain, creating depth to the formation. The key innovation was serial firing. By organizing gunners into multiple ranks and controlling when each rank fired, commanders created sustained fire that was far more effective than simultaneous volleys. The front rank would fire, then immediately begin reloading while stepping backward. The second rank would advance and fire, then the third. By the time the third rank fired, the first rank had reloaded and was ready to fire again. This created an almost continuous stream of fire that was psychologically and physically devastating. At Nagashino, this technique had been employed on an unprecedented scale. 3,000 gunners divided into multiple ranks behind protective palisades had maintained fire for 8 hours. The Takeda cavalry had never faced anything like it. Every time they reformed and charged, another volley tore into their ranks. There was no respite, no opportunity to close the distance before the guns could reload. The mechanical rhythm of death continued until the Takeda forces were destroyed. But the matchlock's effectiveness wasn't universal. The weapon had serious limitations that skilled opponents could exploit. Range was limited to 100 meters for effective fire, perhaps 150 meters at extreme range. Accuracy dropped dramatically beyond 70 meters. An experienced archer could engage targets effectively at twice that distance. Rate of fire was painfully slow. A skilled archer could fire 10 to 15 arrows per minute. A matchlock gunner was lucky to fire 2 shots per minute, and in combat conditions, 1 shot per minute was more realistic. The reloading process was vulnerable. During the 30 to 60 seconds required to reload, gunners were essentially defenseless. Cavalry that could close the distance quickly could massacre reloading gunners before they could fire again. This is what had happened at Mikitagahara when Takeda cavalry overran Tokugawa gunners. Weather was another critical factor. Rain dampened powder and soaked match cord, rendering weapons useless. Wind affected aim and could blow out match cords. Extreme cold made fingers clumsy and affected powder performance. Night combat was nearly impossible unless special preparations were made. The weapons required constant maintenance, barrels fouled with powder residue and needed regular cleaning. Locks had to be adjusted and repaired, springs broke, screws loosened. An army equipped with thousands of matchlocks needed dedicated armourers and substantial supplies of spare parts. The smoke produced by massed gunfire was itself a problem. After a few volleys, the battlefield became obscured by thick white powder smoke that made aiming impossible. Gunners fired blindly into the smoke, hoping their shots found targets. This favoured defensive positions where commanders knew the enemy's likely location. In mobile combat, powder smoke could cause complete confusion. All of these limitations meant that matchlocks, despite their revolutionary impact, couldn't completely replace traditional weapons. Armies still needed archers for long-range fire, spearmen for defence against cavalry, and samurai for shock action and close combat. The key was combined arms tactics that used each weapon system to compensate for the other's weaknesses. Oda Nobunaga's genius lay in understanding these tactical relationships. At Nagashino, he'd positioned his gunners behind protective palisades that prevented cavalry from closing before weapons could reload. He'd used the Rengogawa stream as an additional obstacle that slowed cavalry charges. He'd positioned spearmen to protect gunners if cavalry broke through, and he'd kept samurai in reserve to exploit any breakthrough or counterattack if needed. This defensive doctrine was revolutionary in Japanese warfare, where offensive action and aggressive attack were traditionally valued above defensive positions. Samurai culture emphasized courage demonstrated through attack, not patience behind fortifications. But Nobunaga understood that matchlocks favored defense. The slow reload time wasn't a problem when you had fortifications protecting you during the vulnerable period. The limited range didn't matter when the enemy had to come to you. The inaccuracy was irrelevant when attackers were funneled into kill zones. This tactical innovation, combining firearms with field fortifications to create defensive positions that nullified cavalry, would be rediscovered in Europe during the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War, but Japan had figured it out decades earlier. Other daimyo learned from Nagashino. Field fortifications became standard in Japanese warfare. Armies dug trenches, built palisades, created obstacles to channel enemy attacks into prepared killing zones. The era of mobile cavalry sweeping across open fields was finished. Warfare became more methodical, more calculated, more dependent on logistics and preparation than on martial spirit and offensive courage. The psychological transformation this required from the samurai class was profound. For centuries, warriors had been taught that aggressive attack demonstrated courage, while defensive positions suggested cowardice. The entire ethic of Bushido emphasized facing danger directly, not hiding behind fortifications, but matchlock warfare made these values suicidal. Charging into massed gunfire, however courageously, simply got you killed without accomplishing anything. The most effective tactic was to position yourself behind cover, wait for the enemy to attack, and shoot them down as they advanced. This required a different kind of courage, the discipline to hold position under fire rather than the boldness to charge into danger. Some samurai never adapted. They continued to fight in traditional ways, seeking individual combat and heroic actions, and they died in large numbers. Others adapted pragmatically, recognizing that survival and victory required new methods. The most successful were those like Oda Nobunaga, who completely rethought warfare around the capabilities and limitations of the new weapons. The generational divide was stark. Older samurai, raised in the traditions that had served Japan for centuries, struggled to abandon methods that had brought them success and glory. Younger warriors, who'd grown up with matchlocks as a normal part of warfare, adapted more easily. By the 1580s, a new generation of commanders had emerged who thought of firearms as the primary weapon, with swords and spears as secondary. This shift accelerated after Nobunaga's assassination. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who succeeded Nobunaga, was himself from a peasant background, not a samurai family. He had no attachment to traditional warrior culture and focused ruthlessly on what worked. His armies relied heavily on Ashigaru foot soldiers, particularly gunners. When he invaded Korea in 1592, his military advantages included superior numbers of firearms and troops trained to use them effectively. The Korean campaign demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of matchlock warfare in different contexts. The initial invasion succeeded spectacularly. Japanese forces equipped with tens of thousands of matchlocks overwhelmed Korean defenders who had far fewer firearms and less experience using them. The Japanese captured Seoul in just 18 days, an astonishing achievement. But the campaign ultimately failed, defeated not by Korean forces, but by Admiral Yi Sun-sin's turtle ships that cut Japanese supply lines, and by Chinese reinforcements that outnumbered the Japanese forces. The mountainous Korean terrain favoured guerrilla warfare over the massed formations that matchlocks required, and the logistical challenge of supplying powder, shot and match cord to armies hundreds of miles from Japan proved insurmountable. The campaign revealed that matchlocks, however revolutionary, couldn't overcome strategic mistakes or solve fundamental logistical problems. This lesson, that technology alone doesn't guarantee victory, would be forgotten and relearned repeatedly throughout history. The Korean campaign also saw the first documented use of volley fire tactics by Korean defenders who'd learned from their defeats and adapted Japanese methods. At the Siege of Jinju in 1593, Korean forces equipped with chongtong, their own matchlocks, used serial firing techniques to repel Japanese assaults. The tactical innovations pioneered in Japan were spreading, just as gunpowder weapons had spread from China to the Middle East to Europe, and then to Japan. Each culture adapted firearms to their own military traditions and tactical needs, creating distinct styles of gunpowder warfare. By the end of the 16th century, Japan possessed probably the most firearms-intensive military in the world. Estimates suggest between 300,000 to 500,000 matchlocks existed in Japan, a staggering number considering the country's population was only about 12 million. For comparison, the entire Spanish Empire, the dominant European military power of the era, had far fewer muskets in service. This militarization transformed Japanese society. The constant demand for weapons, powder, and military supplies created a sophisticated military-industrial complex. Merchants who supplied armies became wealthy and influential. Towns that specialized in weapons production gained political importance. The monetary economy expanded as daimyo needed cash to purchase supplies rather than relying on traditional rice-based revenues. But the social costs were enormous. The Sengoku period was one of the bloodiest eras in Japanese history. Constant warfare killed hundreds of thousands, depopulated regions, destroyed infrastructure, and created massive instability. The matchlock, by making warfare more lethal and allowing larger armies, intensified this destruction. The final unification of Japan under Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600 brought peace, but required one last massive display of matchlock firepower. At the Battle of Sekigahara, the decisive engagement that gave Ieyasu control of Japan, both sides fielded massive numbers of gunners. The battle was decided not by heroic cavalry charges or samurai duels, but by coordinated infantry assaults supported by devastating firepower. After Sekigahara, the Tokugawa shogunate worked systematically to reduce military power among potential rivals. The great castles were destroyed or downgraded. Daimyo were forbidden from forming alliances or building new fortifications, and crucially, firearms were increasingly restricted. While samurai could own matchlocks, peasants were largely disarmed through the famous sword hunts that confiscated weapons from the common people. This demilitarization was possible because Japan was now at peace. With no foreign enemies, the Tokugawa could limit military power without fear of external invasion. The 250 years of the Edo period saw matchlock technology stagnate. The weapons used in 1650 were essentially identical to those used in 1550. No flintlocks, no rifling, no technical improvements beyond minor refinements. This technological stasis made Japan vulnerable when Western powers arrived in the mid-19th century with modern firearms. The matchlocks that had been cutting-edge weapons in 1575 were obsolete antiques by 1850. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1854, they carried modern naval artillery, rifles, and pistols that made Japanese matchlocks look primitive by comparison. The subsequent modernization of Japan required completely abandoning the tanegashima in favor of imported and domestically produced modern firearms, but the legacy of the matchlock era remained. The organizational skills, the industrial capacity, the military traditions developed during the Sengoku period all contributed to Japan's rapid modernization. When Japan decided to build a modern military in the 1870s, they could draw on centuries of experience in large-scale weapons production, military organization, and combined arms tactics. The patterns established in the matchlock era, rapid adoption of foreign technology, improvement and adaptation to Japanese conditions, sophisticated manufacturing, disciplined training, all reappeared during the Meiji era. Japan's transformation from feudal society to modern industrial power in a single generation wasn't unprecedented. They'd done something similar with matchlocks 3 centuries earlier. For the Takeda clan, there was no redemption, no comeback from Nagashino. The battle destroyed not just their army but their strategic position. The loss of so many veteran warriors and commanders created gaps that couldn't be filled. Younger, inexperienced officers took commands they weren't ready for. Morale plummeted as the aura of invincibility evaporated. Allied clans sensed weakness and began distancing themselves. Within months of Nagashino, Tokugawa and Oda forces were raiding deep into Takeda territory, burning villages, destroying crops, demonstrating that the Tiger of Kai's heir couldn't protect his own lands. Takeda Katsuyori attempted to rebuild, recruiting new forces, purchasing more matchlocks, trying to adapt to the new military reality. But time was against him. In 1582, a massive invasion by Oda and Tokugawa forces penetrated to the heart of Kai province. Takeda's remaining allies defected. His fortresses surrendered without fighting. The end came at Tenmoku Mountain, where Katsuyori, with just a handful of loyal retainers, committed ritual suicide. His head was taken to Kyoto and displayed publicly. The Takeda bloodline was extinguished. Their lands were divided among the victors. 300 years of history ended in blood and fire. The same castles that had sheltered the Tiger of Kai were demolished. The territories that had produced Japan's finest cavalry were parcelled out to new lords. The military traditions, the tactical innovations, the warrior culture of the Takeda were scattered and forgotten. History is written by victors, and the Takeda became a cautionary tale about refusing to adapt, about clinging to traditional methods when technology demanded change, about repeating the tactics that had brought past success even when facing new weapons that made those tactics obsolete. But this interpretation, common in Japanese histories influenced by Tokugawa propaganda, isn't entirely fair. The Takeda weren't ignorant traditionalists. They'd adopted matchlocks themselves. They understood firearms' importance. What they failed to grasp was the full tactical implications of massed gunfire used defensively. And even this wasn't simply stupidity. The Battle of Nagashino presented Katsuyori with impossible choices. His supply lines were threatened. His reputation was at stake. His army expected him to fight, not retreat. The samurai culture that emphasized aggressive action and personal courage made defensive withdrawal difficult to justify. Katsuyori attacked at Nagashino not because he was stupid, but because his entire military culture, his political position, and his strategic situation gave him no better options. The tragedy wasn't that he failed to understand matchlock warfare, it was that he understood too late, and by then he was trapped by circumstances largely beyond his control. Nobunaga won not just because he had better tactics, but because he controlled the battlefield, had prepared defensive positions, and forced Katsuyori to attack on ground of Nobunaga's choosing. Given the same resources and preparation time, Takeda commanders might have done equally well. But warfare rarely allows such equivalence. Victory goes to whoever can combine tactical skill, strategic position, resources, and opportunity most effectively. At Nagashino, everything favoured Nobunaga. The Takeda never had a chance. The ordinary soldiers who died that day, both Takeda cavalry and Oda gunners, were products of their time, trained to fight with weapons and methods their lords provided, following orders that seemed reasonable given the information available. The Takeda horsemen who charged into massed gunfire weren't fools. They were warriors doing what they'd been trained to do, what had worked countless times before, what their entire culture told them was proper behaviour for samurai. That it got them killed wasn't their failure. It was the inevitable result of military technology advancing faster than tactical doctrine could adapt. The Ashigaru gunners who cut them down were equally products of circumstance. Most were peasant conscripts, farmers and labourers drafted into military service, given rudimentary weapons training, and told where to stand and when to fire. They weren't military geniuses. They were common people doing what they were told, serving lords who would kill them if they refused, hoping to survive the battle and return home. That they participated in a revolutionary military engagement wasn't their achievement. They were tools in a larger process they barely understood. This is the nature of technological revolution in warfare. The individuals involved, whether brilliant commanders or common soldiers, are swept up in changes beyond their control. The matchlock didn't arrive in Japan because anyone planned it. A storm blew a Chinese junk off course, and Portuguese passengers happened to have firearms with them. From that accident flowed consequences that changed Japanese history. Technologies that appear randomly find uses that their inventors never imagined. Tactical innovations emerge from trial and error, from experiments tried in hundreds of forgotten skirmishes before someone applies them successfully in a major battle. The transition from one military era to another isn't clean or planned. It's messy, chaotic, driven by circumstances as much as by deliberate choice. Nagashino became legendary precisely because it crystallized trends that had been developing for decades. It wasn't the first battle where matchlocks played a role. It wasn't even the first time Takeda forces had faced massed gunfire, but it was the most dramatic, the most one-sided, the clearest demonstration that a fundamental shift had occurred. After Nagashino, no serious military commander in Japan could ignore matchlocks or pretend they were just another weapon to add to traditional arsenals. They were the dominant weapon that determined how battles would be fought. The lessons of Nagashino influenced Japanese warfare for the remainder of the Sengoku period. Field fortifications became standard. Combined arms tactics integrating gunners, spearmen and samurai became doctrine. Logistical planning focused on ensuring adequate supplies of powder and shot. Training methods emphasized discipline and coordinated fire over individual marksmanship. None of this was obvious before Nagashino. All of it became common wisdom after, The battle served as proof of concept for ideas that military theorists had proposed, but that hadn't been tested at scale. It demonstrated that properly organized and employed, firearms could defeat the finest warriors in Japan, that defensive positions could channel and destroy attacking forces, that technological advantage combined with tactical intelligence could overcome superior courage and martial skill. These lessons would be rediscovered repeatedly throughout military history. At Crécy and Agincourt, English longbowmen demonstrated that massed missile weapons could destroy French cavalry. At Pavia and Marignano, Spanish terciopike and shot formations proved that disciplined infantry could dominate European battlefields. In the 30 Years' War, Swedish armies under Gustavus Adolphus showed how combined arms tactics with firearms could revolutionize warfare. Each of these examples featured the same basic pattern. New weapons, or tactics, initially dismissed by established powers, proved devastatingly effective when properly employed, leading to rapid adoption and forcing military establishments to adapt or perish. The Matchlocks revolution in Japan was part of this larger pattern. What made it distinctive was the speed of adoption and the scale of implementation. Japan went from 0 firearms to hundreds of thousands in barely 50 years, a faster transition than occurred anywhere in Europe. This reflected Japan's decentralized feudal system, where competing daimyo had incentives to adopt any advantage over rivals, and sophisticated metalworking traditions that allowed rapid adaptation of foreign technologies. The result was a military revolution compressed into 2 generations, from the Portuguese arrival in 1543 to Nagashino in 1575, to the unification wars of the 1580s and 1590s. In just 50 years, Japanese warfare was completely transformed. That transformation came at enormous human cost. Hundreds of thousands died in the Sengoku period's constant warfare. The matchlock, by making battles more lethal, intensified this death toll. Entire districts were depopulated, castles and temples were destroyed, the social order was disrupted as peasant gunners proved, militarily more valuable than samurai warriors in many contexts. The eventual peace established by the Tokugawa shogunate was welcomed precisely because people were exhausted by generations of war. In hindsight, Nagashino marked the beginning of the end for the independent daimyo system. The military techniques that proved effective there, massed formations of disciplined troops with standardized weapons, favored larger political units that could mobilize more resources. Small domains couldn't compete. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu succeeded in unifying Japan partly because they understood and exploited the economics of matchlock warfare. Bigger armies with more guns beat smaller armies with fewer guns. Logistics, industrial capacity, and organizational efficiency mattered more than the valor of individual warriors. The unification of Japan was thus partly a consequence of military technology favoring centralization. This pattern would repeat in Europe, where gunpowder weapons contributed to the rise of centralized nation-states at the expense of feudal decentralization. The military revolution wasn't just about tactics, it was about political power and social organization. The weapons that decided battles also shaped the societies that employed them. For modern audiences, the story of Nagashino offers multiple lessons. About technological change and its consequences, about the gap between military theory and battlefield reality, about how established systems resist adaptation until forced to change by circumstances, about the human cost of innovation in warfare. It also offers a more specific lesson about Japan's historical relationship with foreign technology. The rapid adoption and improvement of the matchlock foreshadowed later Japanese modernization. The patterns established in the 16th century, quick learning, adaptation to local conditions, sophisticated manufacturing, intensive deployment, appeared again in the 19th and 20th centuries. Japan's reputation for technological adaptation has deep historical roots. The matchlock revolution demonstrates this capacity operating centuries before the Meiji Restoration. And for those interested in military history, Nagashino stands as one of the clearest examples of combined arms tactics properly executed. Terrain selection, field fortifications, massed firepower, layered defences, reserves positioned to exploit success, all elements of successful defensive warfare appear at Nagashino. Modern military analysis recognizes the battle as a masterpiece of defensive planning and execution, comparing favorably to much later examples like the Union defense at Gettysburg or defensive operations in World War I. That such sophisticated tactics emerged in feudal Japan developed by commanders who'd never studied European military theory, demonstrates that military innovation occurs independently across cultures when circumstances demand it. The specific weapon, matchlock or machine gun, matters less than the underlying principles of concentration of fire, mutual support, and combined arms integration. Those principles transcend specific technologies. They're discovered and rediscovered whenever military forces face the problem of stopping attacks by combining firepower with defensive positions. Nagashino was one instance of this timeless military problem being solved effectively. That it happened in 16th century Japan rather than 19th century Europe or 20th century elsewhere is historically interesting, but tactically unremarkable. Good commanders figure out what works and apply it regardless of cultural context. Bad commanders repeat failed tactics until they're destroyed. Katsuyori repeated cavalry charges that had worked before but didn't work at Nagashino. Nobunaga developed new tactics suited to his weapons and terrain. One died in disgrace, his clan exterminated. The other became legendary, credited with beginning Japan's unification. Victory writes history. The matchlock wrote victory. And the thunder of massed gunfire on Shitaragahara Plain announced that the age of the mounted samurai was finished, killed by Portuguese weapons in Japanese hands, by lead balls fired by peasant soldiers, by technology that reduced centuries of martial tradition to bloody irrelevance. The strongest cavalry in Asia learned this lesson 8 hours of continuous gunfire at Nagashino. Those who survived never forgot the sound, the mechanized rhythm of death, the thunder that ended an era. The matchlock had spoken, and Japan would never be the same.